there is a category of moment in international affairs that is almost impossible to recognize from inside it. It is the category of moment that looks, from the perspective of the public conversation surrounding it, like another development in a long sequence of serious but manageable developments, another escalation in a conflict that has been escalating, another diplomatic failure in a negotiating process that has been failing, another signal in a strategic competition that has been generating signals for years, and then years later, when historians assemble the full picture of what was actually happening at that moment and what it actually set in motion, the question that every serious analyst is left asking is not why nobody saw it coming. It is why nobody understood at the moment it was happening that it was the moment, the specific inflection point in the arc of the conflict, the competition, and the international order itself at which the trajectory changed in ways that determined everything that followed. That is the category of moment we are in right now. My name is Professor Jiang Xueqin, and if you want to understand why this specific moment matters more than it seems, not rhetorically, not dramatically, but structurally and analytically, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Right now, because this is the deep strategic explanation that the current moment requires and that the public conversation surrounding it is not producing. In this video, we are going to answer 3 precise questions. What specifically makes this moment an inflection point rather than simply another significant development in an ongoing series? And what structural features of the current situation justify that characterization? Who are the decisive actors whose decisions at this specific moment are determining the trajectory that will define the next phase of the conflict, the competition, and the international order? And what is the real logic driving those decisions beneath the public postures that surround them? And from this point forward, what are the realistic scenarios, the path on which the moment's inflection produces a trajectory change whose consequences exceed every current projection, the path on which the moment's significance is recognized and a course correction remains achievable, and the strategic wildcard that could alter the fundamental character of the moment's inflection in ways that current analysis is not adequately modeling. By the end of this video, you will understand not just why this moment matters, but why understanding that it matters. Now, in this window, before the inflection's trajectory has locked in, is the most important analytical contribution available in international affairs today. Let us begin with a context reset, because understanding why this moment is an inflection point requires understanding what an inflection point actually is in structural rather than rhetorical terms. The word inflection is overused in political commentary to the point where it has lost the precision that makes it analytically useful. In the structural sense that this analysis requires, an inflection point is a specific kind of moment. In a dynamic system, the moment at which the forces acting on the system produce a change in the direction of its trajectory, rather than simply a change in the speed at which it is traveling along its existing trajectory. A speed change is significant but recoverable. A system moving faster along an existing trajectory can be slowed, redirected, or reversed by the same kinds of interventions that have worked at previous moments in the trajectory's history. A direction change is different in kind rather than in degree. The system is now moving toward a different destination than it was moving toward before. The inflection and the interventions adequate to redirecting a speed change are inadequate reversing a direction change, because the direction change has altered the structural conditions within which all subsequent interventions must operate. Here's what has literally just happened that constitutes the direction change rather than merely a speed change. Across the preceding period, a specific combination of developments has converged in a way that has altered not just the pace of the conflict's escalation, but the fundamental geometry of the strategic landscape within which that escalation is occurring. 3 structural features of the current situation have simultaneously reached the specific states that, together, constitute an inflection rather than a continuation. The first is the exhaustion of the diplomatic architecture, not the failure of specific negotiations or the breakdown of specific communication channels, but the systematic depletion of the entire framework of mutual interest recognition, trust infrastructure, and creative diplomatic capacity that has historically allowed conflicts at this stage of their escalation arc to be redirected before they complete the transition from managed competition to structural rupture. The second is the consolidation of the external support architecture on both sides of the conflict to a degree of depth and institutional embedding that has transformed it from a discretionary commitment into a structural feature of the conflict's operational reality, a transformation that removes the flexibility in external support relationships that has historically provided one of the primary levers of external actor influence over conflict trajectory. And the third is the emergence of a specific strategic opportunity window perceived simultaneously by multiple actors on multiple sides of the conflict that is assessed by those actors as limited in duration and is specifically favorable to decisive action in a way that the preceding competitive phases have not produced. The convergence of diplomatic architecture, exhaustion, external support consolidation, and strategic opportunity window emergence is the specific structural configuration that constitutes the inflection, and its convergence at this specific moment is what makes this moment matter more than it seems. The prior context that makes the current inflection so consequential is the specific stage of the conflict's arc at which it has occurred. So, inflection points in the early stages of a conflict when the diplomatic architecture retains its full capacity and the external support relationships retain their discretionary character, redirect trajectories within a range of outcomes whose worst case is significantly less severe than the range available at the late-stage inflection that the current moment represents. Late-stage inflection points, those occurring after the diplomatic architecture has been substantially depleted and the external support relationships have been substantially consolidated, redirect trajectories within a range of outcomes that has been narrowed by the preceding stages. Structural changes and narrowed in the direction of more severe rather than less severe possibilities. The current inflection is redirecting the conflict's trajectory within the narrowed range that the preceding stages have produced, which means that the worst case of the current inflection's outcome set is worse than the worst case at any previous inflection point in this conflict's arc. That worsening of the worst case outcome set is one of the primary reasons why this moment matters more than it seems. The media narrative is covering the current moment through the framework it has applied throughout the conflict's arc, a framework that processes each development as a point on the existing trajectory rather than as a potential inflection from it. That framework is adequate for detecting and characterizing the developments that constitute speed changes along an existing trajectory. It is systematically inadequate for detecting and characterizing the specific convergence of structural features that constitutes a direction change, because direction changes are, by definition, departures from the existing trajectory that the framework has been trained on, and frameworks trained on existing trajectories systematically discount signals of departure from those trajectories. The gap between what the existing framework is producing and what the current moment structural analysis requires is the analytical gap that this video is designed to close. Now, let us build a power map, because the inflection's trajectory is being determined by specific actors whose decisions at this specific moment are more consequential than their decisions at any previous moment in the conflict's arc. And understanding their real calculations is the foundation of understanding both why this moment matters and where the inflection is pointing. Start with the actor whose strategic opportunity window assessment is the most direct driver of the current inflection's character. Publicly, this actor is maintaining the posture appropriate to the current phase. The combination of resolve, openness, and restraint that the public management of a conflict at this stage characteristically produces. Strategically, what this actor is actually doing is making a series of decisions that reflect a specific assessment of the strategic opportunity window's dimensions and duration, decisions that are calibrated to exploit the window before its closure rather than to manage the conflict within its established framework. The opportunity window assessment that is driving these decisions has three components: an assessment of the diplomatic architecture's current state of depletion that concludes the window for a negotiated resolution on acceptable terms is closed, an assessment of the external support consolidation that concludes the current balance of external support is as favorable as it will be within any near-term horizon, and an assessment of the opposing actors' domestic, political, and institutional constraints that concludes those constraints have reached a level of binding force that reduces the range and scale of their available responses below the threshold required to effectively contest the action that the opportunity window is being assessed as favorable for. Each of those three assessments may be correct, partially correct, or incorrect, but they are the assessments that are driving the decisions being made right now. And the decisions being made right now are what is determining the inflection's trajectory. This actor's biggest constraint is the assessment's accuracy. An opportunity window that has been assessed as open may be narrower or more contested than the assessment reflects, and acting on an overconfident opportunity window assessment at an inflection point produces the specific category of strategic overreach whose consequences compound through every subsequent phase. Look at the United States, because Washington's decision-making at this specific inflection point is the most consequential variable in whether the trajectory change the inflection is producing is managed or unmanaged. The American decision-making environment at the current inflection is defined by the simultaneous operation of three constraints whose combination is more binding than at any previous comparable moment. The first is the analytical constraint, the systematic inadequacy of the monitoring framework that the current period's surface appearance of managed stability has maintained relative to the cross-domain structural analysis that the inflection's actual character requires. The second is the political constraint, the domestic environment in which the political coalition required to authorize a response adequate to the inflection's structural significance is more difficult to assemble than at any previous comparable moment, given the specific state of partisan division, public attention, competition, and fiscal pressure that characterize the current domestic political landscape. And the third is the credibility constraint, the accumulated gap between prior American deterrence commitments and their actual performance at previous threshold moments, which has reduced the marginal deterrent value of new American deterrent signals relative to the value that equivalent signals would have produced at earlier stages of the conflict's arc. All three constraints are simultaneously operative and mutually reinforcing, producing a decision-making environment whose aggregate adequacy is less than the sum of the individual capabilities that the American strategic system possesses. Look at Russia, because its position at the current inflection is the most operationally consequential of any external actors for the immediate trajectory of the conflict's next phase. Russia's assessment of the inflection's character, specifically its assessment of whether the strategic opportunity window that the primary actor is exploiting represents a genuine window or an overconfident misassessment, is the variable that most directly shapes the material support decisions. That will determine whether the next phase's initiation occurs with the operational backing that the opportunity window assessment assumes, or with a more constrained material basis that would limit the next phase's ambition and duration. Russia's assessment is itself driven by its reading of the American constraint combination and its consistent assessment throughout this conflict's arc that the credibility constraint on American deterrence is more binding than American. Signaling suggests has produced the support decisions that have advanced the conflict to the current inflection's structural configuration. Look at China, because the inflection's resolution, whether it produces a trajectory change that consolidates into the structural rupture that its current direction implies, or whether it is redirected through a circuit breaker intervention and the kind this series has identified as the most viable prevention mechanism, depends more on China's decision in the current window than on any other single variable. China is at this specific moment navigating the most consequential version of the strategic tension that this series has analyzed throughout, the tension between the benefits of allowing the inflection's trajectory to continue in the direction that serves Chinese interests by weakening American strategic primacy, and the costs of the energy, financial, and institutional system, consequences that the trajectory's completion would impose on the Chinese economy and on the alternative international framework that China has invested enormous resources in. Constructing the direction in which that tension resolves in Beijing's current deliberations is the single most consequential, undecided analytical question of the current moment, and the resolution's direction will be visible in the specific character of Chinese diplomatic activity in the days and weeks immediately ahead, not in its public statements, which will maintain the established framework of calls for restraint and dialogue, but in the specific content of the back-channel communications and the specific economic signals that reflect the actual strategic calculation being made. Look at the European allies, because their coherence at the current inflection is the variable that most directly determines the credibility of the collective response architecture, whose adequacy is one of the primary factors in the opportunity window assessment that is driving the primary actor's decisions. European political coherence at this specific moment is more fragile than at any previous comparable moment in this conflict's arc, fragmented by domestic political developments in key member states, by the fiscal constraints of sustained defense spending, and by the specific divergence in threat perception that the conflict's geographic and economic proximity differential between northern and southern European governments has produced. That fragmentation is not a peripheral concern. It is a central input into the opportunity window assessment that is producing the inflection's current direction. And its correction or its deepening will significantly shape whether the opportunity window assessment that is driving the inflection proves accurate or overconfident. Now let us turn to the structural facts, the hard, verifiable realities that explain why this moment is an inflection and what the inflection's trajectory is actually producing. Structural fact number one, The diplomatic architecture exhaustion that constitutes the first structural feature of the current inflection is not a temporary condition whose restoration can be achieved through the resumption of the negotiating activity that its exhaustion has interrupted. Diplomatic architecture is not a process, it is a set of structural conditions, the trust relationships that make commitments credible, the communication channels whose reliability allows for the back-channel management of escalatory pressure, the creative capacity of the diplomatic community to construct frameworks that bridge interests that appear irreconcilable, and the mutual interest recognition that gives each party a structural reason to prefer a negotiated outcome over the risks of continued escalation. Each of those structural conditions has been depleted through the conflict's preceding phases in ways that are not reversible through the resumption of negotiating activity alone. The depletion means that the diplomatic tools adequate to redirecting the inflection are not the tools that have been deployed throughout the conflict's arc. They are a different set of tools requiring a different kind of political investment and a different level of creative diplomatic capacity than the established framework has produced. And identifying those tools and deploying them within the inflections window is the specific diplomatic challenge that the current moment presents. Structural fact number 2. The external support consolidation that constitutes the second structural feature removes the primary flexibility mechanism that has historically allowed external actors to influence conflict trajectories at comparable stages of escalation. When external support is discretionary, when each increment of support is a deliberate choice by an actor that retains the option to withhold it, the threat of withholding it is a credible instrument of influence over the conflict's trajectory. When external support has been institutionally consolidated, when the delivery mechanisms, the organizational commitments, and the political costs of reduction have made withholding it institutionally and politically more difficult than continuing it, the threat of withholding loses its credibility as an instrument of influence. The current state of external support consolidation on both sides of the conflict has moved well past the discretionary phase into the institutionally consolidated phase, which means that the leverage mechanisms that external actors have historically used to redirect conflict trajectories at comparable escalation stages are significantly less available than the established crisis management framework assumes. Structural fact number 3. The strategic opportunity window that constitutes the third structural feature creates a specific time-bounded pressure that compresses the decision-making timelines of the actors assessing the window in ways that systematically reduce the quality of decision-making at the inflection point. Time-bounded opportunities create urgency, and urgency creates pressure to act before the full consequences of acting have been adequately assessed. The most consequential strategic mistakes in the history of major power competition have been made at precisely this kind of moment, when the convergence of favorable conditions created an assessed opportunity whose time-bounded character generated pressure to exploit it before the assessment's accuracy could be verified through the kind of deliberative process that adequate verification would require. The current strategic opportunity windows, so time-bounded, characters generating exactly that kind of pressure on the actors whose decisions are determining the inflection's trajectory. And the quality degradation that urgency-driven decision-making produces is one of the primary risk factors in the current moment structural analysis. Structural fact number 4. The convergence of all three structural features simultaneously. Diplomatic architecture, exhaustion, external support, consolidation, and strategic opportunity window emergence is the specific configuration that the historical analysis of major conflict inflection points identifies as the most difficult to manage through the conventional crisis management tools that the established international institutional framework provides. Each structural feature individually would represent a significant management challenge. Their convergence multiplies the management challenge in ways that exceed the capacity of the existing framework. Because each feature reduces the effectiveness of the tools most relevant to managing the others, the diplomatic architecture exhaustion reduces the effectiveness of the negotiating tools most relevant to managing the strategic opportunity window exploitation. The external support consolidation reduces the effectiveness of the leverage tools most relevant to managing the diplomatic architecture's exhaustion. And the strategic opportunity window creates the time pressure that reduces the quality of decision-making on all three dimensions simultaneously. Structural fact number 5. The inflection's trajectory, the specific direction in which the current moment's structural features are pointing, and the conflict is toward a configuration whose management requirements exceed those of every previous phase in the conflict's arc. at a moment when the management resource base is more depleted than any previous phase. And that combination, increasing management requirements and decreasing management resource base, is the specific condition that generates the outcome range whose worst case is worse than the worst case at any previous comparable moment. And it is the specific condition that makes this moment matter more than it seems, because the gap between the current worst case outcome severity and the public conversation's processing of the moment as another significant development in an ongoing series is the most consequential analytical gap in international affairs today. From this point, 3 scenarios are possible. Let me walk through each with the full precision this moment demands. Scenario A is the unmanaged inflection path, the path on which the 3 structural features convergence produces a trajectory change that exceeds the management capacity of the conventional crisis management tools being deployed, and in which the conflict transitions from the managed competition framework that the established international institutional architecture has maintained to a structural configuration whose character and consequences exceed every projection produced by the frameworks that the preceding phases have calibrated. This scenario does not require any actor to intend the worst outcome. It requires only that the opportunity window exploitation proceeds according to the assessment that is currently driving it, that the response architecture's adequacy is insufficient to contest the exploitation within the window's duration, and that the mutual reinforcement of the 3 structural features amplifies the trajectory change beyond the range that any single feature alone would produce. The early warning indicator of this scenario is not a dramatic threshold event, but a pattern, the pattern of the response architecture's successive inadequacies at each stage of the trajectory change, producing a cumulative departure from the managed competition framework that exceeds the established monitoring system's capacity to characterize as anything other than the situation being serious but manageable. Scenario B is the recognized inflection path, the path on which the structural analysis of the current moment's 3 features reaches the decision makers with the authority to authorize a response adequate to their convergence within the window that the strategic opportunity exploitation has not yet closed. This scenario requires a quality of cross-domain analytical synthesis, a speed of political authorization, and a creativity of diplomatic and strategic response that the established framework has not produced at any previous comparable moment in this conflict's arc. It requires each of the 3 constraints on the American decision-making environment to be partially overcome. Simultaneously, the analytical constraint through the delivery of the cross-domain structural picture with adequate clarity and urgency, the political constraint through the construction of a domestic and allied coalition sufficient to authorize the required response, and the credibility constraint through a response posture adjustment that is sufficiently above the established framework's parameters to be credible as a deterrent to opportunity window exploitation, rather than as a continuation of the existing competitive posture. The demanding simultaneity of those 3 requirements is what makes this scenario difficult and what has prevented its production at previous comparable moments. Its achievement at the current inflection would represent the most significant performance of the international conflict management system at the most demanding moment this conflict has yet produced. Scenario C is the circuit breaker wildcard, the path on which China deploys its structural leverage as an interruption mechanism within the inflection's window, producing a trajectory change in the opposite direction from the one the opportunity window exploitation is producing, and establishing a new competitive equilibrium that is more stable than either the current trajectory's destination or a confrontational response would produce. This scenario activates when China's internal deliberation results in favor of circuit breaker deployment, when the assessment of the energy, financial, and institutional system costs of the unmanaged inflection path exceeds the assessment of the strategic benefits of allowing the opportunity window exploitation to proceed. The resolution of that deliberation is the most consequential, ongoing strategic calculation in international affairs, and its direction will be visible in the specific character of Chinese diplomatic and economic activity in the days and weeks immediately following this analysis. Let me now bring this directly home, because the inflection and its consequences connect to your daily life through channels that deserve clear and specific articulation without the abstraction that structural analysis can sometimes produce. The economic and financial channel is the most immediate and the most concrete. An unmanaged inflection of the kind the current structural features convergence implies would produce economic disruptions in energy markets, in financial system stability, in supply chain functionality, and in the trade architecture that supports global economic growth, whose severity and duration exceed any disruption the post-2008 period has produced, because the current inflection structural features have depleted the stabilization mechanisms that manage the post-2008 disruption's consequences. Every household that pays an energy bill, services a mortgage, or depends on a labor market whose health is connected to the global trading system is financially exposed to the consequences of the current inflection's trajectory, an exposure that is real, that is growing as the structural features converge, and that the current public conversation's processing of the moment is systematically failing to represent accurately. The institutional governance channel reflects the inflection's consequences for the international system's capacity to manage the global challenges, whose governance requires multilateral cooperation, climate change, pandemic preparedness, nuclear non-proliferation, and economic stability among them. An international system whose institutional architecture has been damaged by an unmanaged inflection at the current moment is a system whose capacity to manage those challenges is reduced at precisely the point in their respective trajectories when adequate management is most consequential. The governance deficit that the inflection's institutional damage produces is not a temporary condition. It is a structural reduction in the system's management capacity that persists through every subsequent governance challenge whose management the depleted institutional architecture is asked to provide. The security architecture channel reflects the inflection's consequences for the specific alliance commitments and deterrence relationships whose credibility is the primary security guarantee of the countries whose populations depend on them. An inflection that demonstrates the limits of those commitments' credibility at the current moment imposes costs on the security environment of every country whose defense planning has incorporated the assumption of those commitments, reliability costs that manifest as increased defense spending requirements, modified operational planning, and the specific anxieties of populations whose security framework has been revealed as less robust than their governments. Assurances have suggested the democratic governance channel is where the inflection's most politically proximate domestic consequences will be felt by the populations of the democratic countries most directly involved. An unmanaged inflection produces the specific combination of accountability, pressure, economic hardship, and security anxiety that tests the resilience of democratic political systems in ways that the established frameworks of democratic governance management are designed to address under normal conditions, but that the inflection's scale and character would impose at levels that exceed those frameworks' design parameters. My read on the current moment is this: the three structural features whose convergence constitutes the inflection, diplomatic architecture, exhaustion, external support consolidation, and strategic opportunity window emergence, have reached the specific combined state that makes the current moment an inflection rather than simply another significant development in an ongoing series. The unmanaged inflection scenario is the most probable outcome if the recognized inflection scenario's three requirements are not assembled within the window, that the opportunity window exploitation has not yet closed. That window is open, but is being closed by the exploitation's advancement at a pace that the established monitoring framework is not tracking with the cross-domain resolution the inflection structural character requires. Short term, the most critical analytical task is the cross-domain synthesis that makes the three structural features convergence visible as an integrated inflection rather than as three separate domain developments, and the delivery of that picture to the decision makers with the authority to authorize a response adequate to the inflection's character rather than to the established competitive framework's requirements. Long term, the outcome of this specific inflection will be assessed as the moment at which the conflict's trajectory either was recognized and redirected within the window that remained, or was allowed to complete its direction change into a configuration whose management consequences will define the strategic environment for the generation that inherits them. Why does this moment matter more than it seems? Because the three structural features whose convergence constitutes it are directing the conflict's trajectory in a direction whose consequences exceed every projection produced by the frameworks that the preceding phases have calibrated. Because the window within which a response adequate to the inflection's character remains achievable is open, but narrowing at a rate that the standard monitoring framework is not tracking with the resolution the inflection requires. And because the gap between the public conversation's processing of this moment as serious but manageable and the structural analysis characterization of it as a genuine inflection point is the most consequential analytical gap available to close in international affairs today, do not follow the established framework's processing of this moment. Follow the structural features, the diplomatic architecture's depletion trajectory, the external support consolidation's institutional embedding, and the strategic opportunity window's dimensions and duration that together constitute the clearest available picture of why this moment is what it is and what remains of the window in which understanding that changes the outcome. If you want to continue receiving this kind of structural, precise analysis before the events that confirm it have occurred, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so the next analysis reaches you when it matters most. News changes fast. Structures change slow. Know the difference. And that is precisely what we are here for.